Hi folks, greetings from rural New South Wales. I'm currently visiting my parents. I just watched the Canon announcement of the R1 and the R5 Mark II, and I know a lot of Canon shooters have been somewhat impatiently waiting for these announcements, so it's a big day for Canon shooters. Now, I'm not typically a Canon shooter. I shoot more Nikon and Hasselblad, but I'm fortunate with the channel that I get to basically test out and use all of the different equipment. I have already been in touch with Canon in Hong Kong to ask to get a hands-on with these as soon as possible so I can give you a more rounded out thought. Right now I am pretty much going off what was in the launch video, which wasn't much, and the specs and a couple of little bits and pieces that I've seen online, especially at B&H Photo, that obviously had early access to these. Now, before we jump into it, if you haven't already, if you head on over to my website, mattgranger.com, you can sign up to my website and I'll send you out a free copy of my guide to improving your portraiture and keep you up to date with the new videos that I have coming out. Now in this, I essentially want to look at how these cameras fit into the Canon range, comparing it to like the R3 and the original R5, have a look at what's new, and kind of focus a little bit on the gaps, the intangible things that I can't test right now, but what my instincts are what are really going to make or break these cameras. One thing I've been giving some serious thought to lately also is that we can come in with so many expectations. There's always this process of hype or disappointment, and then eventually things kind of start to settle down. Certainly, I think a lot of people were expecting these cameras to follow a certain path because of what Nikon have done or because of what Sony have done. It doesn't mean that that is necessarily what Canon need to do. So we, and the other thing is, as someone who does love my gear, we all need to remember from time to time that not every camera that's released is for you or for me. There are cameras from all manufacturers that don't suit my needs. That's disappointing. I might have wished that they had released something different, but the camera is what it is. We have to think about who it is actually for, and then does it deliver for them, not what it should have been. Like the R1, for example, is a 24 megapixel backside illuminated stacked sensor. It's not a global shutter and it's not using a higher res sensor. That's what it is. It's pretty clearly aimed specifically at sports, high-end sports, maybe photojournalism, Olympics, that kind of thing. And there are things that are going to really elevate it for those kind of users. Whilst some people might have wanted 36, 45 megapixel, I don't know that that market specifically really is after that. So let's jump in and take a little look. Now, I pulled out some top-line features here. The R1, so new flagship, it's I think 2.1 pounds, which brings it in half a pound lighter than the previous DSLR flagship that it's replacing. The interesting thing with this one, I think it's pretty clear that it is less of a jump over the R3 than the R5 Mark II is over the R5-1. And I think that's actually borne out in the price differences as well. If you take a look here, the R3 was, what are we talking, just a few $100s less at launch than the R1, whereas the difference between the R5-2 and the R5-1 is almost $1,000. Kind of shows you how big of a leap we're talking here. So there's a lot in common between the R1 and the R3. Let's just actually take a look through. I've got the R5-2 in there as well. So you can see as we're going through here, there is a lot that's similar on these cameras. One thing that's worth pointing out, the R3 had electronic shutter up to 64,000th, whereas the R1, it's only going up to 1/16,000th. This isn't like the Z9 or the A9 Mark III that don't have a mechanical shutter. This camera still does, even though it says it has an incredibly fast readout. It was actually interesting to hear in the Canon Europe launch when, the Canon interviewer was asking the Canon rep, why not go for global shutter? The response was fairly weak to me. It was something along the lines of, we didn't use it because we don't need to use it because this is really fast already. That, I think a stronger statement would have been, the people that this is aimed at are dealing with challenging lighting situations. Banding and that kind of thing can come in if you're using electronic only. That's why we went for a mechanical shutter, and why we didn't go for a global shutter is the trade-offs. The technology's not there yet. You suffer a hit in dynamic range and all of that kind of thing. That would have been a strong response. Just saying we don't need it because this is fast enough kind of reeks of the arrogance of Nikon and Canon 7 or 8 years ago when they were saying that mirrorless doesn't have a future. Meanwhile, Sony was charging on. If you can hear a bell ringing in the background, that's my parents' cat just waking up. Do you want to come on camera, Harley? Ooh. He's a real beauty, aren't you? Okay, ISO sensitivity, just chill with me. We're talking up to 102,000 with the R1, like the R3, but that both of the new cameras are saying that they have some new neural network AI for reducing noise in images. Okay, bye-bye. Crazy, the kind of things we're talking about now. But there's a couple of things in here that I think are new, like new. So we've seen AI learning for autofocus, but this is saying that it does something deeper than that. I saw a really cool presentation on B&H Photo of the R1 specifically, where it was in soccer or football mode, and as two people are playing, it's focusing on the one person. As they kick the ball to the other person, as the ball almost gets to the second person, the focus jumped to them. The autofocus was able to tell in that sport the person who has the ball is the most important one, even though the two people were the same distance from the camera and they weren't crossing over each other. Then as that person kicked it back to this person, the focus jumped back to them again. Pretty crazy, and they're saying by that when it ships, it's going to cover basketball and volleyball as well. So that and the neural AI noise reduction is crazy. And both cameras are able to, not using pixel shift, do some kind of AI upresing in camera to give you 4 times the resolution, which is kind of crazy, but there is a limitation hidden away in the fine print that it's based off a JPEG, so it can't do that with a RAW file. As we continue. So the R3 in electronic shutter could do 30 frames a second, up to 120 frames, whereas the new camera, the R1, will do 40 frames in electronic, and they're both doing 12 frames mechanical. The R5ii, incidentally, is doing 30 frames electronic and 12 mechanical. That's with 45 megapixels. Fair to say, however, I think that the R5ii does have pretty much everything the Canon shooters were hoping it would bring from the Canon shooters I know and have been talking to. Primarily amongst them having the ability to do the Swedish style of dancing. It's got C-Log 2 clogs, a pair of them. And it's coming with a variety of different groups with it, which is quite interesting, including one that has a built-in cooling fan. Now, looking on B&H Photo, unless they're modeled up, it seemed like the Ethernet only grip costs more than the Ethernet and cooling fan. It also, they mentioned that, and as we get down to video capture here, that the recording limit, the R5 Mark II, does have 120 minutes in 4K, but in their presentation, they mentioned that in 8K 30, it gets about 30 minutes in RAW before it's going to overheat, but as soon as you plug in the cooling fan grip, it goes up to 2 hours. So I don't know then if that's hitting the 2 hour limit that the camera has limited, or if it's then at its heating limit. Who knows? But fair to say, the R5ii is a beast in terms of video performance. We now do finally have a Canon camera using 2 proper card slots. So we have the R1 using CF Express Type B. It's also using a full-size HDMI instead of the ridiculous micro that the R3 was lumbered with. Going down. I don't know if this is the case, but it's saying that the R1 is only giving you Wi-Fi 6, not 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. I'm guessing maybe they just don't have the full stats right now. but it does have a bunch of different I/O there, which is going to be important for people who are shooting in the field, trying to get the images onto the wire. And speaking of that, I should mention, whilst a lot of us, myself included, armchair critics, raw, a lot of sports photographers I know are shooting JPEG, the end. So, and a lot of news people as well. So the idea that you have to be able to do everything in RAW, when I mentioned before about the upresing, it's not the case for everyone. If you're trying to get a shot of some news event or an amazing catch in a game of sport, and you want to get it on the wire, get it to the agency, to the homepage of the website as fast as possible, they actually want JPEG most of the time. Taking a look down further though, something that did surprise me, the R3 has the biggest rear monitor with double the resolution, 4.15 million dots, compared to 2.1 on the R1 and 1.6 on the R5 Mark II. In terms of the EVF though, the R1 is by far the better, up at 9.44 million, and it's got an eye point of 25 mil and by far the biggest magnification at 0.9. Given that it and the R5ii have the new and improved eye focus, which is something you really have to try out, there's no point even talking about it, but if you don't know what it means, it will track where your eye is looking in the frame and you can have the autofocus move to that point. It's freaky, but it actually works quite well. Now, just jumping out for a second, there are a couple of other things here that I think are quite important, like the Digic accelerator that goes along with the processor now that's meant to increase the processing power significantly and allow those different AI and autofocus technologies. Great, both cameras, as well as having the upresing in camera, are having half a second of pre-capture, which does include RAW, and it includes video, interestingly. So you can record 3 to 5 seconds of video on the R5 Mark II in pre-capture, or half a second of stills, so that's up to 20 or 15 frames, depending on which camera and which mode you're in. Now, really, there's very little on paper that is wow about the R1, and I'm not saying that as a hater, because I really think the thing that's going to stand this out above all of the other Canon cameras and maybe all of the other mirrorless cameras on the market right now is the autofocus. So apart from what I mentioned, and I'll pop in a little bit here of that passing the ball that B&H Photo showed, the autofocus points. So the R3 was already incredible. That's using 1,053 phase detect points. The R1 has 4,897 for stills, 4,067 for video. And that, again, blows away the R5 Mark II. So I think we really need to get it in hand and try it out, because I don't think the spec sheet is going to bear out what an incredible camera the R1 is actually going to be. And another thing, as someone who is an off-camera flash portrait shooter, really cool to see the maximum sync speed is higher on the R1. We're up to 1/320th of a second rather than 1/250th on the others. It's using the same battery as the R3. Most of the other things are the same, but you notice that, 0.7 of a pound bump in weight once you're loaded up with the battery and everything compared to the R3. So what do you think? My top line takeaway would be that I think the R5ii is a really solid upgrade, delivered on what people were hoping for, that I can't really see a huge, people love to talk about how Canon love to limit their cameras and leave things out to annoy their users. I can't see anything big there other than it's a big jump in price. The R1 on paper, I don't think is a really blow your hair back kind of camera, but I can't wait to get it in hand, because if the autofocus is as good as I imagine it's going to be, I think that is where this is going to come to its fore. And with the different dedicated sports modes, I think this is so squarely aimed at sports photographers. Now, just jumping in and comparing it to the Canon and Sony variants, I wasn't sure whether to do the A1 or the A9 III, but seeing the A9 III is also squarely at sports, it's also 24 megapixel. I thought that's maybe the better of the two. You can see they're all quite different cameras. The Canon is still the most expensive, despite I think they brought the price down from what it was probably going to be. There are some obvious differences, you know. We've got an 80,000th of a second electronic on the A9 III, 32 on the Nikon, 16 on the Canon. The R1 is giving you a native ISO range up to 102,000, whereas the Nikon, that's only in high 2 mode, and pretty much the same on the A9 Mark III. So it'd be really interesting to see how that high ISO performance is doing, and to see, again, not throwing shade, but Canon haven't in the past generally had the same dynamic range as the Nikon cameras or the Sony cameras, because you know they were often sharing sensors. So it'll be interesting to see how this one's doing. Is it AI wizardry kind of artificially giving us a cleaner image, or is the sensor just performing amazingly well? And I wonder, in this day and age, what do you think? Does it matter what's the cause? You can see the video specifications of the R1. We've got a bunch of different options there, even though it's not even the flagship. Similar in terms of displays, except the Canon is still the smaller of the three, same resolution, but it has pretty much exactly the same resolution as the Sony, but it is actually smaller than the Sony. It's great that it's up at a 0.9 magnification. It's beating the Nikon for sure, but the A9 III has a significantly bigger EVF. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on both of the releases. What do you think of them? How do they compare to the other Canon cameras and to the other cameras that they're competing with, at least on paper, out there in the market? Let me know your thoughts. I'll be back in Hong Kong soon. Got loads of great content to come. I just put live a video from LA shooting with a bunch of different boudoir models. Don't forget to check out all the different links below, including my free guide to portraiture. I'll see you guys soon.